Thank you all so much. I will take this weird dinosaur piñata with me and replace this fella on the stage with someone we are all very excited to have here, Alexander Chee.
Hello. Thank you to Leah, Gwen, and Adam for bringing me back here, bringing us all back here, or bringing us all here for the first time, etc. Convening us, how about that? It's a huge pleasure to do this work with all of you. Okay, so last time I was here, I read from a memoir in progress, and this year I thought I would try something a little different for me. I workshopped this with my department recently, and they said, "Does this have a genre?" Which I thought was a pretty good, sign of what it might become. It's called The Children of Atlantis. Part 1, Homo Aquaticus. According to my mother, the first time I was brought to the beach, I was afraid of the ocean. My father dismissively walked me up to the water and threw me in. "No son of mine is going to be afraid of the water," he said. And thus began a series of lessons on how to swim, eventually including body surfing and snorkeling, and how to survive a riptide. My father was a diver, fisherman, and a one-time would-be oceanographer who had to leave school when I was born to go into the family's fisheries business in order to support his new family, working for his father. At the time of this lesson, he was on the beach with me on the island of Truk. A year later, by the time we got to Guam, I was 5 years old and swimming, and I even preferred swimming underwater. One of the first things he taught me was how to hold my breath and push out my inner ear with a yawn, effectively sealing my ears and nose with air. I can do it without thinking, and it helps on airplanes also. I remember how often I'd look up while descending to the bottom of a pool to the thrashing body of another child swimmer struggling along the surface. They all seemed so afraid of going under. But as far as I could tell, there was not one thing to fear down there except returning before I wanted to. I then learned another diver's trick from him to expel the air from my lungs. Air made you buoyant, and soon I enjoyed watching the bubbles curl up toward the surface as my body became heavier and my feet touched the ground. When I could go down further to lay for a moment on the floor of the pool, I would smile and watch the bubbles leaving my mouth, and then hold my breath so they stopped. In those moments, I pretended I belonged there. The swift kick I used to launch myself back to the surface for air, for a breath before returning below, was all that reminded me that I was a liar. The pool where I did this most was the pool of a luxury hotel in Guam. There was a smaller children's pool I swam in first. My father took pictures of 3-year-old me and 4-year-old me, 5-year-old me, in a scuba mask almost the size of my head, taken underwater with his beloved underwater Nikon. We were never guests of the hotel, but in 1971, my mother was a statuesque blonde who liked bikinis and white sunglasses, and she was welcome anywhere she wanted to go. So it came to be that I was able to go every day of the 3 years we lived there to swim at this hotel. I especially liked to stand on the bottom of the swimming pool and look up to the water's surface, I would hold on until I couldn't wait any longer, and with one push, the water sliding over my head, all at once, I felt powerful. The world fell silent, illuminated by the light falling down around me in sheaves of blue. I preferred to swim underwater and not the other way, the way everyone else seemed to swim. I would put my hands at my side and kick like a dolphin. That other way of swimming across the top didn't make any sense to me. It looked noisy and hard. People choked from splashing near their face as they tried to breathe, and they struggled to pull their limbs over the water in what was called a crawl. Also, this name for it, the word crawl, it just sounded terrible. Soon I could cross the pool underwater in a breath. My younger brother was learning to swim also, and my father taught us to play a game he called Gumby is Drowning, where he would throw my plastic Gumby doll into the pool and we would race dive down to get him. I loved this, but it was all practice for when my father would put me on his back in the ocean and take me snorkeling along the reef. He'd say, "We're playing dolphins now," as dolphins piggyback their young to teach them how to swim. Out along the reef with his scuba slate, he taught me the names of the fish, radiant and prismatic like everything seemed to be in that water. As I watched the tropical fish glow and shift along the reef, heaven, to me, wasn't in the clouds. It was down here. I eventually told myself the only explanation for my feelings was that I was actually a dolphin, left behind among humans by my real parents. And sometimes I would stand in the ocean, silently commanding them to return to me and take me home. I'd seen Aquaman do this on the Super Friends. My childhood interest in telepathy and parapsychology began by watching the cartoon Aquaman communicate with the creatures of the sea that way. The concentric circles of mental communication expanding outward from his forehead made complete sense to me. It was a ripple, and water was the reigning metaphor for my existence. When we moved from Guam to Maine when I was 6, I was desolate to find myself in a land with such a cold ocean. My mother signed me up for swimming lessons at the town high school's enormous pool, and I was a quick study. When at age 10, I discovered the TV show Man from Atlantis and watched Patrick Duffy swim across the screen the way I had back in Guam, I had the confirmation I needed. I wasn't a dolphin, but an Atlantean, clearly. By the age of 13, I could swim almost 100 yards underwater at a breath, more if I had fins on, racing my father until I won. If I'd known about Jacques Cousteau's ideas for Homo aquaticus, I would have signed up for any experiment he wanted. In 1965, 2 years before I was born, Jacques Cousteau gave a speech at the World Congress on Underwater Activities in London. He was there to describe his recent success with his first underwater living experiment, Continental Shelf 1, known as Conshelf 1. 2 of his divers had just become the world's first aquanauts, living and sleeping in the Diogenes, an 18-foot steel cylinder named for the Greek beggar philosopher who had lived in a bathtub. Cousteau was a consummate showman and on a mission to save the world's oceans by making the exploration of them seem like the most exciting mission in the world. And he did it in every deliberate public appearance, every film, every photo, and television show. He was like the James Bond of ocean exploration and offered up his research with wit and panache and affection for ancient Greeks. With Conshelf 1, Cousteau had tested his idea that nitrogen-enriched divers could stay underwater for days at a time. The Diogenes had been sunk at the level of 30 feet near the island of Frioul, which is near Marseille, and his 2 aquanauts had lived there for a week, more disturbed by the initial near-constant contact with the paparazzi Cousteau's media efforts brought to the project than by being underwater. They were tested twice daily by doctors, monitoring their condition, and constantly observed by TV crews and reporters covering the event. One of the divers, Albert Falco, recorded in his diary of the last night a visit from Cousteau, complete with a bottle of wine they couldn't open easily in the pressurized atmosphere. And this is a quote, and he called Cousteau the Pasha, just FYI. The Pasha is thinking of deeper stations, several buildings constructed in stages, a Himalayan reverse with Base Camp 1, Camp 2, and so forth, on down, where we would stay weeks, even months, to work. He talks of colonizing the continental shelf. We would all live underwater with wives and children, with schools and cafes, a real Wild West. I can see Claude as sheriff of the deep. That day in London, though, Jacques Cousteau was less of a pasha and more of an oracle, or perhaps a Dr. Moreau. A new species of human being is evolving, Homo aquaticus, he said to the startled scientific audience. After living in compressed air habitats for a generation, water people will be born at the bottom of the sea. They will breathe by extracting oxygen directly from the water after operations to surgically implant gills in their throats, bringing humanity back full circle to the sea. Diving has gone beyond sport. It is now a worldwide movement. The imperative need is to place swimmers underwater for very long periods to really learn about the sea. I think there will be a conscious evolution of Homo aquaticus spurred by human intelligence rather than the slow, blind natural adaptation of species. We are now moving toward an alteration of human anatomy to give man almost unlimited freedom underwater. Cousteau came to diving as a young French Navy pilot, shy except when his beloved Pathé film camera was in use making amateur movies at friends' weddings. He believed he might have a future as an auteur. One fateful evening in 1936, he drove his car off the road and his injuries were severe. His right arm was paralyzed and he'd had to refuse his doctor's attempts to amputate it. After months of pain and physical therapy in the face of a slow, seemingly stalled recovery, one of the offers on the boat to which he'd been assigned suggested he begin swimming in the ocean. Slowly, his body began recovering strength, and then one day, that officer handed him a pair of diving goggles and the strange prototype for the swim fins we'd all come to know. Cousteau was a skeptic as to their value for as long as it took him to go underwater once and then never again. I have always found it curious that my father's family had almost nothing to do with the sea. Cousteau's son, Jean-Michel, wrote in My Father the Captain, his memoir of Cousteau. Cousteau was driven to it, arriving at the water's edge numb with lack of sleep and pain. The very next thing Cousteau did was to try to film underwater. From that moment on, the more he swam, the more he took pictures, the more he explored underwater, the more his career and his fame grew. Cousteau was a visionary, an entertainer, a hustler. He knew he was competing for his livelihood and the fate of the world too. And yet he knew that he had to make it all entertaining as well, that for the world to save itself, or at least its oceans, it would have to be entertained, or it would turn away. And so it is that he saw these first attempts to live underwater as stages and film sets also, and treated them accordingly. It would ultimately win him enemies as well as friends, but it may be the only thing Cousteau knew better than the ocean was humanity. The Homo Aquaticus announcement was sincere, I think, but it was also show business, the show business of saving the ocean. After Cousteau's Homo Aquaticus announcement, he installed his next crew on a reef in the Red Sea, inside of a starfish-shaped undersea home complete with air conditioning that allowed the all-smoking and mostly French crew to smoke their cigarettes, and Cousteau his cigar, the tobacco burning twice as fast in the pressurized, oxygen-rich environment, where their hair grew twice as slow and their bruises healed in a day. Cousteau did it all with a French adventurer's flair for the audiences, but himself also. He didn't want to be saved from life on the surface if he couldn't smoke and drink. And he likely knew most people felt this way too. His ship, the Calypso, had its own Côte du Rhône, bottled and supplied to the lodge, as he called it, no doubt preferable over champagne because at that pressure, champagne was always flat. His wife Simone, also a diver, went down to escape the heat on the surface and soon decided she wouldn't return, instead deciding they would celebrate their anniversary there. In the introduction to the richly photographed coffee table book he made of the adventure, World Without Sun, he writes, "I was finishing my first meal in a comfortable wilderness lodge we had built 3,000 miles from Paris. The chef passed the fruit and cheese, the coffee and cognac. I was in the congenial company of my wife Simone and a group of cheerful and trusty friends. There was a gay ambiance to the dining salon. The tape recorder played. I looked around the five-sided room at the mass of indexes, switches, lights, dials, loudspeakers, and television screens on the communications console, at the branching dormitory and workshop wings that gave the place the name Starfish House, and at the windows beyond which stretched for hundreds of miles of black and silent land which human foot had never touched. Faint gleams of ectoplasm suggested the presence of wild creatures in the dark. A man went to the console and flicked two switches. One plunged us into darkness. The other turned on powerful flood lamps outside. The windows turned into jewel chests lined with blue turquoise from which spilled a cascade of gems, tiny crustaceans, larval jellyfish, swimming worms, and glittering hatchetfish risen at night from the abyss to feed. Beyond the shining mass that was drifting in a half-knot current were pewter and bronze gleams of big predators that suddenly struck among the little ones, snapping them up and speeding back into the night. Into a silver line of dancing sardinellas came a big black ramified monster with a single gleaming eye, almost as large as its head. Hovering head down, this implausible animal tapped at the pane and waved its long pectoral fins. Someone yelled, "Hey, it's Pichun Pei," the nickname of Seaman Antonio Lopez. We were in Continental Shelf Station number 2, Conshelf 2, the first human colony on the seafloor. The Starfish House oceanaut divers all wore silver suits in case they were lost or injured or dead. The lights would pick them up easier, and the silver was a visual signal to anyone who was rescuing them not to bring them up above the level of Starfish House for medical treatment, as their blood was nitrogenated, and the trip straight to the surface would harm them even more. The two divers down at the deeper station were called Black Masks, and their helium-rich environment made their normally deep voices high, which made everyone laugh when they checked in. Puckish, rakish fun. Come see the men and women who live under the sea. Section 2, The New Atlantis. Cousteau writes in his autobiography about how his inspiration to create Conshelf 1 came in part from a vision he had after seeing a medieval illustration of Alexander the Great, slung under the water in a glass chamber bound with brass, inspecting the walls at Tyre in Lebanon before his famous invasion of the city. Alexander the Great was not only the ruler of one of the greatest empires in the ancient world, but also the star of a popular series of stories called the Alexander Romances, published in France, Spain, Russia, the Balkans, and across the Middle East, starting in the 4th century after his death and extending until the 15th. The author is given only as Pseudo-Callisthenes, so called because he is not the real Callisthenes, the historian of Alexander's court. He just posed as him. The stories of Alexander the Great expanded in the telling, and while this ancient type of bathysphere was in the original Greek, the medieval Germans loved it best, expanding on the story and the illustrations. The siege of Tyre in Lebanon in 332 BC is the setting, an island resistant to Alexander's forces. Whether Alexander did this or not, the story is that Alexander viewed his soldiers at their preparations from under the water and inspected the walls of the island fortress also. As Aristotle, his teacher, did write of his using a kind of diving bell in the Problemata, a bronze tank lowered into the water from which the diver could enter from below for air, There's a very good chance Alexander tried it or something like it. His account was translated from the Greek by Archpresbyter Leo of Naples in 950 AD, here in turn translated from Leo's medieval Latin by Charles Messner. And the quote is, "I sent for astronomers and geometers and ordered them to construct for me a vessel in which I might descend to the bottom of the sea and investigate the wonderful animals which live there. They said that this could be done only in the following manner, that we should make a jar entirely of glass and bind it with chains and have it controlled by very strong soldiers. When I heard this, I at once ordered such a thing to be made. In this way, I investigated the bottom of the sea. I saw there fish of diverse shapes and colors. I saw the other animals having the appearance of land creatures walking over the bottom of the sea like quadrupeds. They kept coming up to me and running away. I saw there other marvelous things also, which I cannot relate." Over the years, Alexander's underwater adventure became even more of a fiction. Sometimes he is pictured like this, under a boat with many gentlemen assisting in the chains. Sometimes he is in a romance with the chain to the glass barrel being held by his most trusted mistress, who lets go when she is unfaithful. I like to imagine the source of the strength of such a mistress to hold such a chain, though of course we know his even having such a mistress was also something of an imaginary feat. The medieval illustrations are glorious and fanciful. The ancient bathysphere is sometimes a glass barrel, sometimes a bubble, sometimes a sheath. It may or may not have been reinforced with leather or brass. It may or may not have given off light. Dr. Mirabilis, also known as the Friar Roger Bacon, wrote with great confidence about it in 1240 in his Letter on the Secret Works of Art and Nature and the Invalidity of Magic. And I quote, "And instruments can be made for walking in seas and rivers, right down to the bottom without bodily danger. For Alexander the Great used these to see the secrets of the sea, according to what Ethicus the astronomer says." Bacon was one of the most important men of science during his lifetime, and he often quoted his friend Ethicus in his writings, mentioning him in his work on codes as well, but we know Ethicus only through him. I do not know why Alexander called for an astronomer to help him, but perhaps Ethicus knew. And why would a great king undertake such a great risk himself? The single best reason to support the story at all is that of all of recorded history, the first reason to go underwater was to make war. Truth or legend, what is verifiable to us is that soon after discovering his love of diving, the young Jacques Cousteau counted these illustrations of Alexander as among his inspirations for the career that followed. Alexander dangling on the chain, a lure that led us to the bottom of the sea. Well before the time I was imitating Patrick Duffy in my swimming pool in Maine, the idea of Atlantis as a city under the sea with living inhabitants who could live underwater was so entrenched in the culture it is almost impossible to remember it as a rumor about a ruin sourced as a third-hand account in one of Plato's last works. And it had remained a rumored of ruin, a lesson in the hubris of a nation and a people who had gone too far with their experiments in science until the 17th century and the publication of Sir Francis Bacon's posthumous speculative novel, The New Atlantis. Sir Francis Bacon had been one of the most famous thinkers of his age, an essayist who created the scientific method and became a powerful court official and royal advisor. A bribery scandal near the end of his life eclipsed his work for a time. He pled guilty and did time in the Tower of London. But while his term was only for a few days, the scandal and the guilty plea made a jail of his last years. He lost a position at court, and while he continued writing, he no longer had the power he once had. He died of a cold he caught while experimenting on whether cold and ice could help preserve chicken. But he was also instrumental in the settling of the United States, one of the signers of the Virginia Territories Agreement, and his unfinished novel became one of the most influential documents in the world as regards the settling of that territory. The plot's basics are so imitated it might be hard to understand it as the source code to so many works of science fiction that came afterward. It is, for example, the plot of nearly every Star Trek episode. A ship of explorers is lost with steadily decreasing provisions and desperately ill passengers. They discover a mysteriously happy and scientifically advanced country that informs them that they cannot stay, but can at least stay until they are well enough to travel again. The explorers discover the inhabitants are not what they seem, but it is a utopian novel, and so that is about as sinister as it gets. The mysterious country they've discovered is named Bensalem, populated by a Christian people, all speaking European languages, which is eventually revealed to have been built on the remains of the fallen Atlantis. They are the post-Diluvian descendants of the survivors, and as a result, have used science to help them be more human and humane, happier in the face of mankind's immortal problems, and even tolerant of religious difference. They have vessels for both flying in the air and traveling under the sea, have done away with politicians and rule themselves with a meritocratic society of scientists and thinkers called Solomon's House. They send embassies of them abroad to study other cultures and return with their findings so that New Atlantis becomes a repository of the best of human knowledge. They trade in light, the light of knowledge. The novels was in some ways the dream of his years of disgrace, written at that time alongside his great work, The Great Instauration, and acts as a kind of mirror to it, the non-fictional and fictional versions of the same thing. The Great Instauration imagined a global system for the collecting and recording of knowledge, and the New Atlantis imagined society based on such an idea. Lauren Isley, one of our finest contemporary essayists on science and the natural world, wrote about Bacon and the New Atlantis in The Modern Dilemma. Isley speaks of how it was odd for a man of this kind to write a novel, but the New Atlantis meant to do what Bacon, as a man and a disgraced scientist, could not. Condemned to spend his life in a world of sometimes petty, often dangerous court intrigue, he chose to encourage a world the monarchs he served could not imagine, a world of schools, of research promoted by the state, a world in which more could be done than that which, as he phrased it, could be projected in the hourglass of one man's life. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please welcome Stephanie Powell Watts.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Good, good. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me in this amazing space. I would like to be the first to thank Leah, Gwen, and Adam. Of course, that's a joke. And everyone who makes this conference possible. I was here a few years ago. It was a very different space, and I'm just thrilled about that. You know, it gives me hope for it gives me hope for the world, that things can change with vision and hard work and goodwill, that, you know, and thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of that. I'm really touched and grateful. I've struggled a lot with what to read. I'm working on a novel, and you know, I have a draft of it, but I don't know, it feels very raw now, so I don't know about that. And so I decided to read a story based on a tidbit of information that I eavesdropped on when I was a child. When grown people were talking, did your people say that? Grown people are talking, so you know that means leave the room. And so I heard my mother and her sisters and probably sisters-in-laws too talking about this woman from the community. She was in her 40s, and she had moved out from her mother's house because she'd found a man. And this was somebody that nobody thought was going to find a man. And what was so crazy about this is that all those women got divorced and left the men that at some point in the 70s and the 80s that they were originally were with, but they still talked about her not having this man like it was a huge problem. I distinctly remember the term shacking up. You know, I had not heard that before. That was really exciting. So the woman had left her mother's home. She was in her 40s. She still lived with her mother. And she left her home, and she moved in with this man. And then very soon thereafter, she came back. And so that was the big talk of the town. So this story, I can't, I won't have time to read it all, but I just, I'll stop in the middle, and there's a whole middle part that I won't have time to read. I was talking to Holly about this, and we were talking about a story that if you can cut out the middle, maybe you didn't need it, so maybe I don't need it. So I'll read the beginning and a little bit of the end. The story is called Family Museum of the Ancient Postcards. In April 1976, my Uncle Silas on my daddy's side got out of jail early after 2 years and 5 months of time served for arson. We welcomed him with dinners and backslaps, ignored the pink guilty splotches on his face, places on his skin that would never fully heal, regarded him with a child's wonder, his disappearing act a magic trick. Now you don't, but now you do see him. July 76 was the bicentennial for white people, and though we agreed with our black Muslim cousin and black nationalist neighbor, whose 200 years of freedom, we all marveled at the fireworks in town, bigger and better than usual, some of us with our arms crossed over our chests in protest, but all of us with our faces tilted to the clear sky. But most remarkably, late in that year, 41-year-old Jenny Harshaw, my mother's aunt's child, my cousin, though I called her Aunt Jenny, found a husband. We'd given up on her long ago, but just when she had ceased to be a variable in the world of change, Aunt Jenny shocked us with Gerald, 5 foot, maybe a little more, with a big round belly taut as a starving child's. Though Aunt Jenny was an imposing woman, tall and big-boned, a woman's beautiful, her cheekbones, the women said, her long fingers like a pianist, they said, no man had ever noticed apparently except for Gerald. Our family talked to my mother's, her sisters and brothers, wives of brothers. Everyone had something to say about Aunt Jenny and Gerald. But none of our mocking importance or our jokes made Aunt Jenny twist in shame or doubt the certainty of her mind. Nothing stopped her from rushing like a teenager out her mama's door when Gerald's Gran Torino rattled up the drive. He's not afraid, she said, and neither was she as she launched herself into the world. After all those years of living with her mother and her dead father, gone now for 25 of those years, she finally flew the coop. On the way out the door, her hard suitcase on the porch already, she would return for her personal things soon, she said. Pillowcases of summer clothes packed in the trunk of Gerald's car. She bent to her mother's chair. Bye, Mama, she said. Once on the porch, she threw a kiss to her father and said, thank you, merciful God. At that same moment, she thought she'd never again have to hear her father's dead steps in the attic behind her, no more heavy breath, sour from old cigarettes, lingering in the dark places of the creaky house he put together with his own hands. It's enough, she thought, not sure if what she felt wasn't ecstasy. Poor Aunt Jenny. She didn't know, and how could she, how dangerous and foolish it is to count on anything for the rest of your life. We didn't hear much from Aunt Jenny in those early months, though we saw her every week on Sunday at my grandmother's. She stayed close to Gerald, served him food like the other wives, patted his hand, looked at him with what we thought was longing when he stood up too early to take her back to their home. We tried to get him to talk and included him the best we knew how. His people weren't neighbors or friends of ours. They were poor blacks, what we called boomer rats, who lived in dark houses out on tangled dirt roads on the fringes of the county. Our own dirt roads and tiny houses where we lived were exempt from our judgment. We thought we could make nice talk, let him know he was free to sit among us. We told him how Jenny cooked the best turkey, juicy, we said. Years ago, we said Jenny's hair was a marvel, black and shiny as a satin sheet, long enough for her to sit on. One time, a man tried to buy it right off her head. Jenny would run her hand through her now short hair, embarrassed to have all that past called up. And though nobody told it, Aunt Jenny knew we were all thanking Gerald for making her the one we'd all called the lost cause, as normal as any of the other women. Gerald nodded, squinted his eyes in concentration. "Is that right?" was the most he'd say. A couple of times Aunt Jenny came to Sunday dinner, alone, dumb, waiting for the best moment to make her excuses and leave. But soon, though no one is exactly sure when, Aunt Jenny stopped coming at all. "Oh, it's too far," she said. "We're busy, you know how it is," she said, deepening her voice, hinting at sexual delight she hoped the long-married women remembered and coveted. But we knew Gerald was to blame. He was the only person to change Jenny, the only one to make her want to snap her inertia, shed her kidnapper's robes, leave them in a snaky heap behind her. Whatever roots he worked, prayers he hurled on the air, we knew without fighting it that it was powerful magic. Our best hope was that Aunt Jenny was too happy not to play along with Gerald. We were, of course, disappointed. Almost 8 months after her departure, Aunt Jenny came back to us with lips grim and set in a freeze that even death couldn't remove. Aunt Jenny rode shotgun beside her mother in the passenger side of that old Buick, her clothes and pillowcases in the back seat, the hard case luggage, a high school graduation present, forgotten in the rush. "My nerves can't take all this," Aunt Jenny's mother said as she parked in the drive, theatrically lumbering to her chair in the living room, "and you ought not put me through it." Her clothes out in the car, Aunt Jenny rested in her room, tried not to look at the lumpy pillowcases, leaking panties, and hastily stuffed polyester from open tops. She kicked the bag off the edge of the bed. "I'm back," she whispered, sure her father had heard. We wouldn't say it to her. We are not cruel. But we knew all along Aunt Jenny would return. Late marriages can't take, we nodded in agreement. The old are tired, sapless, and try it, be our guest, but you can't make it without hope, the antidote to despair. The old people have lost that. Though we wanted different for her, we knew Aunt Jenny's story would take one of just a few predictable shapes. The way they told it, Gerald beat Aunt Jenny for being tall, for glancing at him without tenderness as he drifted to sleep, for trying to prove that he could be loved. Aunt Jenny would not say, but something brought her home in a hurry. Aunt Jenny tried. You have to give her that. We saw her trying, felt her trying. We knew that what she wanted was the glad day when the life with Gerald that she knew was just around the corner would materialize. "You'll learn fooling with low-class niggers," Aunt Jenny's mother said, the smug joy in her heart obvious on her face, a cool, cutting brightness. Now Aunt Jenny would have no reason to ever again refute what her mother said. I suppose Aunt Jenny's return to Mills Road and her mother was the only reason that she and I connected. She was then a 42-year-old woman, not even divorced, since she never really married like I assumed, and I was 14. To say we have a lot in common is wrong on the face of it, but same knows same. One desperation calls out without speaking to another, and we became friends. In the midst of the murmur of the family crowd, the occasional dolphin-high screams of the smallest children, the chatter, "Do we have more paper plates? Mama, can I have? Cal, can you turn down that television? Is this the last of the cake? Linda, Joyce, don't let your boys play on the stairs." Aunt Jenny retreated to the living room, forbidden for children, with her romance novel from Goodwill and a pencil. So Aunt Jenny and the narrator, they go on an adventure together to see Gerald, and she has not quite yet given up on the idea, Aunt Jenny has not, that Gerald will be in her life. And so I'm skipping over that part. We'll get to the end. My family arrived at my grandmother's early the next Sunday. Though the front door opened many times, Aunt Jenny did not come. I didn't get to listen to the sounds of the house with her or see her pretzel her long legs under her body as she read her trashy book about white people in implausible adventures. Just before dark, I walked to her house. I walked to her house to the green paint glowing the color of forgetting in the fading light. I could hear her waiting inside, her tents holding out behind the door. "Aunt Jenny, let me in," I yelled. I was 14 and in my worst, most painful year. I wanted to tell someone about it, confess it, but there was no one. And worse than that, there was really nothing to tell. But still I made a vow that when my own daughter is 14, I will fill that gap for her. I will not let her flounder disconnected and alone. And I believe I would have followed through on that promise. I know it to be true. But although I have felt her in quick flashes of being in my belly over the years, she was just as quickly gone. It would be years before I would finally accept that she would not arrive. In the car the very next Sunday, my father made his usual speech, full of the dread of his in-laws, people who forever thought him too common. 7 o'clock, baby, I mean it, no later. But my mother had decided that her life amounted to those Sundays and she would stay as long as she pleased. I was sure Aunt Jenny would not be at my grandmother's, but there she was, in the kitchen at the table, cutting herself chocolate cake. "There's my girl," she said. "Come help me eat this." So much happened in the coming weeks. The grapes we picked turned to wine by themselves, the bucket forgotten and abandoned outside to become crunchy with insects and drowned bees. A boy I considered falling in love with rammed his hand between my legs on the bus, fluttered his dirty fingers in my lap, while his friends hooted like sports fans. For a quick, sweet moment, I thought that meant I was desired. And late one Saturday night, the phone rang long and lonesome, not the discordant ring of the wrong number or the quick, bright ring of my mother's sisters, but the drawn-out moan of bad news. Aunt Jenny was in the hospital, unconscious from a bottle of pills. If her mother hadn't come back early for the forgotten thing on the kitchen table, she would be dead. "I'm going to the hospital." My mother wrapped the stretched yellow cord of the telephone around her hand. "Come on, go with me." I did want to go, but I was more afraid than I'd ever been. For weeks, my mother and I had spoken in the language of long pauses and slammed doors. We tried as much as we knew how, but the eye of whatever was passing over us, it had moved on, and we were in the storm of it. How can I tell you how hard it is to want not to love your mother? How much and in how many ways I would struggle not to let her know that she means a damn to me. "Why is Aunt Jenny's sister buried in their yard?" I said, my voice trembling. "You listen to me," my mother said, her face rabid with anger. "Your Aunt Jenny is sick. You're old enough to understand." My mother sighed, holding the top of her head. "I don't like liars," I said. My mother's face dropped with shock, but also something like despair. "It's not even her sister, is it?" I taunted, knowing the truth, but not yet realizing how dangerous and insignificant the truth is in a life. "We don't have time for this. Let's go," she said, talking slowly. My mother was trying hard not to hate me. I knew it, and I blamed her, though I hated me too. The only difference between us is that she would forgive me. We had been close friends for years, better than friends, but in that moment, and many like it, neither of us understood that we would be friends again. "I'll go when I'm ready," I said, careful to stay just out of the range of her arm. "You make me sick," she said, and she snatched her pocketbook from the table, jingled her keys for comfort. "Suit yourself, but you always do." The next Sunday at my grandmother's, 2 days after the funeral, the mood was quiet, at least for a while. Aunt Jenny's story was played over and over. Her hair, should have seen it. "That Gerald, he's to blame. You know he is. It's a shame. It's a shame. Did you see him at the funeral crying, looking pitiful and ignored as an ugly child? He should cry," we all agreed. But Aunt Jenny's mother didn't blame Gerald. All day long and for the rest of her life, she'd find a way to insert in conversation that Aunt Jenny died of pneumonia. She told the lie so many times, her face clear and untroubled, she finally convinced herself. And in no time at all, 2 hours, 3, we ate, became many generations in the small rooms of my grandmother's house, and we closed over the hole Jenny's passing made, a stone dropped into a lake. It has been years, nearly 20, since Aunt Jenny lived in that old house on Mills Road, a gravel road now with fine gray dust from pulverized rock in layers over the red clay of my childhood. Now my cousin Mavis and her kids live there, but they will go soon. Nobody stays long. Nothing works right in the old house, and newer is better, we all know that. I was 33, old as Jesus, and had just buried my mother the last time I went inside. My mother, B.B. Marilyn Harshaw Thomas, had always said that she wouldn't live to be old, and she was right. It is a cliche to say she was right about a lot of things. It is also true. The old greenhouse was seemingly stuck in the same stage of decay it had been 20 years ago when Aunt Jenny invited me in. Aunt Jenny's room was the room Mavis's daughter shared with her toddler brother, the little boy too young to have any opinion, so Aunt Jenny's old room was still a girl's room. Though Mavis's child plastered the wall with Disney and television cartoon characters, all I could still see were Aunt Jenny's music boxes in a row on her dresser, dozens of fraying romances, her record player with the handle carrying box, the neat stack of her 45 we danced to one afternoon until we got tired of the heavy jumping, skipping the needle, her twin bed covered in white cotton bedspread like a corpse, and in the closet heaps of clothes Aunt Jenny would scoop up in a hurry if someone ever waited for her in the driveway again. And her father, still there. But not after that day. I would stay until he came into the room, and for as long as it took, until I felt him vibrate on the air. He would not be staring over a child this time. This day he would face me, a woman who never desired to love him, a woman sure she'd lost for the second and final time the person in the world who loved her most. You don't get too many people who love you like that. For them, I would force him out of the house for good. I would scream at him, fight him if it came to that, for Aunt Jenny, still and forever 42, for my mother, whom I would never see again in this life, but would feel when I woke every morning, her palm warm on my forehead. "You have to get up," she'd whisper, and I'd jerk awake, eager to follow her voice. "Get out. Get out," I screamed. I'd make him hear it until my throat was raw and sore, and he would. May God strike me dead if I lie, but before I left that house for good, I heard his retreating steps, the mincing steps of a coward. I heard the creak of the front door, the cold draft, colder than it should have been. I can feel it still. Seconds before the front door slammed, shaking the frame, final as an axe blade. It is now closed. It's closed. Thank you.